The hand of spring had swept aside the frost. In fact, from on high it was possible to see the extent of its advancement into the land. As he watched, a whiteness that had a blurry border approached. There, small purple flowers bobbed against the snow's edge. The character of the world rolled back a season above this point. The travel back in time might have been perfect, except the wild river was alive, even where it flowed from the wounds in the flank of massive glaciers near the top of the world. And this reversal was just an illusion of elevation. Time marched onward. Pure waters boiled over stone and surged through sunny, treeless plains to feed the moss, lichens, and shrubs that made the north a patchwork of ochre, green, and russet below, and now a little behind him. It would wind like white stitchwork through the Taiga mountains and foothills down to his boreal home. All of this was visible, streams of caribou by hundreds of thousands, stooping garfalcons tumbling down columns of sky, and the distant horizon undulating with mammoths coming to graze, right up to the point that he whipped over snowy mountain peaks going so fast everything was a blur. Then, in a hollow between crags over a cluster of dead and uprooted trees, topped by newly shorn evergreens, the dragon opened its fist. He gritted his teeth as he dropped close to 20 feet in those fresh needles with a woof of air on impact and bounced. Crying out would only draw more attention to him. When he came to a stop, his consciousness spun and wheeled like hail sucked back up into the clouds. For a moment he rolled along the green, passed between huge branches, and fell downward and away from the massive creature that pulled at its wings and settled on the edge of the bowl of crags. For a moment all was still. He became aware again because the big dragon made a low bubbling hiss. This was not hostile. It was calling to its young. From between branches, both green and orange with age, a pair of heads reared up on swan-like necks of blue. From where he'd rolled to a stop, he could see one of them all too clearly. Winter dragon pups, brimming with cold, now awake. Their unfocused eyes sought out what had dropped into the nest. They were young, but he was young too, and he had no intention of becoming their next meal. He checked for his weapons, found his fighting knives were still in place, bound against his hips and knees, and discovered he was not bleeding. They were keen once they smelled blood. Then he crept along the trunk that his cloak had been hooked on. He scarcely breathed, and his wildly searching eyes finally came to rest on a glint of dark ahead. In a way, it did his young heart no good to find the spare. It had a gorgeous hardwood shaft carved around its length with a long vine that led up to a vicious iron blade. It was stout, but quite old. It was also of Alvisk make. Even if he was a Fata prince, that meant that his people had made this weapon. They were all elves, after all. He made a soft hiss as he fought to work the spare free, its neglected hardwood biting into his palms, till he pulled it from where it had been buried by newly uprooted trees. Then he held it close against his guarded chest. He made a soft and exasperated oath when he realized he wore only pale chain mail over fawn-colored leather armor, all under a mottled cloak. It was something he knew helped to hide him in the frosty north, but none of it was going to survive even the first assault of a young dragon. If these dragon pups got a direct shot at him, he would die. He laid a hand over his racing heart and willed it to calm. Even a suit of Dwaro steel, he shifted at a soft screech above him. Even armor carved from the core of the world wouldn't do me any good right now. And his heart would not slow. He started to heave with shallow breaths. The first cracking pops of the young dragon pups made him cringe. Their excited voices sounded like ice breaking. They rooted in their bedding, hunting for the meal, crawling around somewhere in the nest. He was small and wily, but the advantages of dragons were already running their course inside his body. He panted and it shifted his whole figure, edging back from the dragons above him. Waves of poisonous disorientation wrapped in gut-wrenching fear began to shiver through his nerve endings. Here it came, the full force of their dragon avarice, the same force that kept full-grown dragons from ripping growing ones to shreds. It was the job of avarice to control the strong and capable and convince them that they were weak, panicked, and out of control. It was this contagion that made people make critical mistakes, the kind that ended lives. And he wasn't an adult yet. He didn't know how to fight this. He gritted his teeth under the onslaught of it. For a moment, he thought he'd scream and howl, but this wasn't his father's kingdom. He'd left that behind. Even if he was a child, if he wanted to live, he had to quieten himself. No one was coming for him because no one knew where he was. It didn't help that, earlier in his day, he'd been spotted and then carried off by a dragon. So the disorientation included him. Now his trembling fingers squeezed a spear until his mind registered that he had a weapon. He had one. He wasn't helpless. It murmured above the panicked thunder of his heartbeat and the screaming inside of his brain. He breathed deeply and turned his young head. They were digging in the nest. Almost as soon as he thought it, a snubbed head poked down through the branches to his left, and its baleful eyes, frost blue specked with violet, tried to adjust to the shadows. This one was perhaps 10 feet long. Its puffs of breath smelt like offal. He froze, held his breath. There'd be 3 of them. Might be. Stronger dragon pups, often teamed together to kill and eat the smallest and weakest among their number. That was often one of their first solo kills. They would savage and eat their own mother if she fell down with a wound. Dragons might have been despicable creatures, but they were also all but unkillable. Of all the elves, only a handful of his breed, of Fates, could do it. He certainly didn't number among those legendary dragon slayers, so hiding till he could escape was his only hope. He burrowed down farther and finally met icy granite. Not even being the prince on Spira made one capable of stopping a dragon. A shadow passed over him. The trees above him shifted and compressed wildly. A young dragon snapped up a tree and shook it so hard that needles fell on him in a downpour. He used that cover to scramble along the edge of the nest. He backed out until one booted foot met the cold air at the peak. He glanced back and down the cliff, the fist holding old dead branches gripped harder. If the branch broke, if he failed to still himself on the edge of the stone crag, he would plummet. Deep breaths. And he pulled himself to rights. The frustrated dam made a crackling bleat that covered his frantic crunching back into the nest again. She was impatient for her young to find him. It was rare indeed to capture prey like him. The Fates were the most powerful and magical breed. The next tree they pulled up would either have exposed him or thrown him headlong off the stony cliff, except he wrapped an arm and leg around the trunk and held fast as the dragon pup shook it back and forth with a violence that was bone-jarring. His entire job became to hold tight, keep the spare, and not fall to his death. Also, not to yell under the pressure of the avarice, the dark storm of which began to build in Eire like a lightning storm. The frustrated dragon hurtled the tree out of the nest and off the cliff. And so he gasped and started scrambling up the trunk. The thing had solved one problem by creating another. Now his white hair streamed out behind him amid the branches as the tree glided down about a quarter of a mile to drop to the tilted snowfield below. His eyes widened as the snow rushed up at him. The tree tipped back in air, and he pulled a deep breath, mercifully free of avarice now, content even if he as little as died clear-headed as the cone-bearer struck. But the snowpack was soft, and the tree landed with the severed trunk pointing downhill. It made a bone-rattling bounce that threw him up in air, and then he crashed down in its upper branches as the tree glided down the grade. The 2 pups plunged down after him,